negritude, pride in Black identity, cultural rebirth, and resistance to colonial alienation. Next objective is to understand the influence of negritude on Francophone and Anglophone literatures. And last but not the least, you will know the enduring legacy of negritude. All right? So as far as I progress, ask questions and everything. Those who are on the YouTube, can you hear me, please? It seems that the YouTube is not still working. Those who are on the YouTube channel, can you hear me? Can you post? Those who are on the YouTube, can you hear me? All right. Okay, so now it seems that it's working. All right. Now the negritude movement. The negritude movement was one of the most influential literary and cultural developments in the 19th century. It's important to know what the negritude movement is exactly. The negritude movement was one of the most influential literary and cultural developments in the 20th century. You learned it in secondary school, particularly in Sogon. You were introduced to the negritude movement. It was an introduction for you to see what it did, how it contributed to the rehabilitation and the promotion of Black history and culture. What you need fundamentally to know is that the negritude movement was one of the most influential literary and cultural developments in the 20th century. Because it was in a century that Black people had to mark their intellectual potential. It was the time that Black people had to do a kind of cultural affirmation to deny what history has refused to them because of a certain discrimination and a certain lack of consideration. So emerging in the 1930s and 1940s among Francophone, African, and Caribbean intellectuals in Paris, the negritude movement represented a passionate affirmation of Black identity, dignity, and cultural values in the face of colonial racism and alienation. So in terms of beginning, understand that the negritude movement is started in the 1930s and 1940s. And it emerged among Francophone and African Caribbean intellectuals in Paris. It was a time when many African intellectuals and others from the diaspora stayed in Paris, they met there, and they gathered to create a literary movement that is a response to the historical, things that happened to them. What are those? Because the Black race had been discriminated, dominated, and a little bit misrepresented and not respected at a certain moment. And then they created this movement as intellectuals to say that the movement represents a passionate affirmation of Black identity. Black identity had to be revalorized and they had to show and prove Black dignity, and they had to show and prove the cultural values in the face of colonial racism and alienation. Understand that that was a time of colonization. Many countries like Senegal or any other in Africa or around the world were colonized. And also the Black people were not very much represented and not respected. So it was both a literary movement and a philosophical awakening. Okay? So the Negritude movement was a literary movement and a philosophical awakening. What was its objective? It wanted to reclaim African humanity and heritage from psychological domination of French colonialism. If you see, the Negritude movement was mostly, promoted by Francophone writers. It's because these people also reacted against the French domination of Black Africa through colonialism and everything. So the number one thing of the movement, philosophically or literally or culturally, was to reclaim African humanity and heritage from the psychological domination of the French. So origins and context, or I simplify it, say origins and historical context. The Negritude movement was born among young Caribbean students who had left their homelands to study in France. I told you when the movement grew, it grew out of the hands of very brilliant, grandchildren of Africa. African students who are from the Caribbean, the diaspora, who were in France, who studied there. They gathered, they left their homeland. It's just like now the trends, many students leave Senegal and they go to France. So they gathered there as students, some from the Caribbean, others from the African diaspora, and they created the movement. At France, they encountered both the intellectual vibrancy of European modernism and the painful experience of racial discrimination. Those who left their homelands, these former students of Africa, they went to Paris. They stayed there. They were in contact with European modernism. They saw what happened there, how it was developed. And also, they encountered another difficulty, what was a painful experience of racial discrimination. Because they were in the midst of, change and conflicts also, cultural and racial conflict. There were Black people, they experienced really the racial segregation. Some tend to say that they were alienated from their native cultures. Yeah, some of them were considered alienated from their native cultures, yet unaccepted by the colonial center. So these writers began to question the European narrative that portrayed Africa as primitive and inferior. Yeah. Number one thing, these intellectuals, they challenge, what is called racially the complex of superiority and the complex of inferiority. The complex of superiority is when the white people, white race considers that it is superior to the Black race. And the complex of inferiority is when Black people accept that they are inferior to white people. That's a problem. All right? So there was also a European narrative, a Western narrative, considering Africa as primitive It means we had no civilization. Our culture was not important. And also considering that we are inferior. You studied in philosophy what Hegel did. Hegel considered Africa as a dark continent, the dark continent, the continent of ignorance. That's what Hegel theorized, that African people did not have any civilization. We were not civilized. We did not know anything. We were ignorant. That's what Hegel theorized in philosophy. And wanted to challenge both theses, saying that Africa was not a primitive continent, and Africa was not an inferior, race. And then the debate is started. All right? So class familiarized with the complex of superiority and the complex of inferiority. The complex of superiority, I repeat, is the thesis, the position of white people who think that they are superior, or Europeans who think that they are superior to us. But not all white people, be very careful, not all white people. There are some white people, or there are some Europeans who are pro-Africans. As you can see, some Africans who are pro-Europeans. So that's why you see the complex is very complicated. The complex of superiority is those who believe that they are superior to us. They can be European, they can be white people too. So the complex of inferiority is the African people who believe, or the Black people who believe that they are inferior to Europeans, or they are inferior to Black people. So the debate is there, and it is important to understand where the problem is. Is it fine, class? Can I continue? Is it okay, class? All right. Okay, so three figures became the intellectual pillars of negritude. Aimé Césaire from Martinique, Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal, our first president, and Léon Gontran Damas from the French Guiana. So together, they articulated a philosophy of Black pride and cultural renewal. Cultural renewal means cultural renaissance. So they rejected the idea that European civilization was the only path to human progress. So they had a kind of contradiction. They counterattacked this theory. Even in history, you have learned Eurocentricity versus Afrocentricity, or Eurocentrism, a philosophy that believes that, humanity, everything, progress, science belongs to Europe. And Africa, as Hegel said, is a dark continent, the continent of ignorance. These intellectuals rejected this thesis. All right? They said, no one had to accept the idea that European civilization was the only path to human progress. So the writings of these intellectuals, Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, and Léon Gontran Damas, insisted that African traditions, values, and aesthetics possess their own inherent worth. So they revalorized African culture and African history, said that no, we had our own culture, we had our own civilization, we have our own literature, arts, and aesthetics. There are Black aesthetics. They are alive, and people need to know them. So Aimé Césaire's interesting work, a long epic poem, Cahiers de Retour au Pays Natal. In English, the title is Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. It was published in 1939, and it is often considered the founding text of the movement. Yes, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, or in French, Cahiers du Retour au Pays Natal by Aimé Césaire, is a founding text of the movement. In the text, Aimé Césaire expresses both the anguish of colonization, l'angoisse de la colonisation, the anguish of colonization, and the redemptive power of rediscovering one's Black identity. So, and also he expressed the sense of redemption, proving that Black people want to express their identity, to show. So Senghor, meanwhile, used poetry and essays to celebrate African communalism, spirituality, and emotion as complementary to European nationalism. So Leopold Sédar Senghor also used his influence in writing, including poetry and essays, to celebrate, African communalism, African spirituality, and emotion as complementary to European rationalism. So the second section, we deal with philosophy and goals, philosophy and objectives of the Negritude movement. So at the core of the Negritude movement was an attempt to redefine Blackness as beauty, creativity, and humanity. So the essence of Negritude was to give a redefinition of Blackness. Yes, there should be a kind of redefinition, because the definition European gave to Black was not good. Yes. The definition that European gave to Black was not good. Remember what Hegel said, Africa, the dark continent. Dark means ignorance. Dark means obscurity. Dark means darkness. The continent of ignorance. No civilization, no progress, nothing. So the core and the essence of the Negritude movement was to attempt to try to give a positive and redefinition of Blackness as beauty. He said, no, Black is beauty. Black is beauty. That's what Senghor said, Femme Noire. Go and read Senghor, Femme Noire. Go and read other great poems by, African and diasporic literature. They said also Black is creativity, Black is humanity. Yes. If people agree on this, yes, Femme Noire, you read that poem by Senghor, and you see what Senghor says about Black beauty. Yes. So Negritude celebrated the emotional depth and rhythm and communal spirit of African culture. So Negritude is or was a way of revalorizing. It was a means of revalorization and a means of appreciation. It was a response to the stereotypes. So the movement, the Negritude, was partly inspired by the Harlem Renaissance in the United States, where Black writers like Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Claude McKay had begun affirming African heritage and protesting racial oppression in the 1920s. Yes, if you see the Negritude movement was also influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance happened in the United States, and the center, the foyer, was New York. You see great writers like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and the founding father of the Harlem Renaissance was Alain Locke, Professor Alain Locke. And you see that writers like William Du Bois influenced them. Yes, William Du Bois, great intellectuals, influenced the Harlem Renaissance. and also the Harlem Renaissance writers, they influenced the Negritude writers, because the Harlem Renaissance was also praising and defending the Black race, but in the context of America, because there was racial segregation. And African Americans were victims of slavery. So understand the connection between the Harlem Renaissance and the Negritude movement. The Negritude movement defended those values that the Harlem Renaissance launched and defended, with great intellectuals like William Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and others. So Senghor, he described negritude as, I quote, the sum of the cultural values of the Black world. C'est la somme des valeurs culturelles du monde noir. C'est l'ensemble des valeurs du monde noir. That's what Senghor said, negritude. The sum of the cultural values of the Black world. So for Senghor, it was not simply racial pride, but universal humanism, grounded in African experience. So Senghor wanted to show the world that we are a big sense of civilization and culture, that Africa is proud of herself, Africa is proud of her children, Africa has its own culture, Africa has her own civilization. Go and read David Job, Africa, My Africa. Africa of the pride warriors of the savannah. You see how David Job praises Africa to show that Africa has great children. Africa has great warriors. That's Africa, My Africa. Africa of the great warriors of the savannah. It's very important. Read other poets. They all engage in the same battle and struggle to show that there is a misconception, or there was a misconception. Europeans did not represent Africa the way they had to represent Africa objectively. So Africans had to show and promote their history and civilization. So you see here again, literature is a means of struggle. Literature is a weapon for struggle. La littérature est un moyen de combat, est un moyen de libération. You learned the importance of literature. Be very careful, class. Literature is not only coming and singing, writing poems. Many people do not know it. Great people in the world, or scholars, became famous or big celebrities thanks to literature. If you think Aimé Césaire was a great man, or Senghor, they were engaged in politics, but they are more known in literature. You see. So Césaire saw negritude as an act of rebellion. Yes. For Césaire, he used poetry as a weapon. He used poetry as a means of self-defense. Yes. They used literature as a self-defense. When the negritude movement attacked Europeans, Europeans were not happy. They say, yes, that is self-defense. We can say anything we want because you attacked us. So Aimé Césaire used poetry in his Cahiers de Retour au Pays Natal and other collection of poems. So for Césaire used a poetic and political weapon against colonialism and assimilation. For Césaire, negritude was a poetic and political weapon against colonialism and assimilation. Damas also, Léon Gontran, in his satirical poems such as Pygmalion, yes, read Pygmalion by Léon Gontran Damas. He used a biting humor to expose the hypocrisy of colonial societies. Yes. Damas expose the hypocrisy of colonialists, thinking that they have a kind of superiority, trying to show that there is no complex of superiority. There is no complex of inferiority. That was hypocrisy. So negritude writers wanted to recover, to get back. It means to get back what colonial education had suppressed. It means what colonial education came with a lot of prejudices. You are not civilized, no school, no religion, no civilization. We have to bring you literature. We have to bring you civilization. We have to bring you culture. Remember what I told you in the introduction. The literature of Africa is as old as its people. It was not introduced by European. It existed before European. Chunya Achebe said that African people did not learn of culture from the Europeans. Now, African people did not know of culture for the first time from the European. Now, I don't know who that is. If UNCHK, if everyone had their own definition of blackness, how could they have a common purpose for this identity? No, do not understand if everyone individually. There are two camps, the European camp and the Afrocentrist camp. The Eurocentrist and the Afrocentrist. It is like Europe versus Africa. Not as you think, so I define blackness in my own way, you define blackness in your own way. It is a matter of positive and negative. European people define black as negative. You remember Malcolm X. Malcolm X said that he checked a dictionary. He found more than 100 definitions of black. All the definitions were negative. Black, dark, ignorance. At that time, even the dictionaries made mistakes because it was a propaganda. It was Western propaganda. Yes, it was Western ideology, thinking that African people should be minimized, not respected. So in terms of race and identity, we are black. So in terms of definition, what they think black is negative and everything, so we can only be what is characterized by them. You see? And so it was not easy. So the black people had to react. So there should be a response from Africans. All right? There should be a response from Africans. So people like Senghor, I told you, go and read Femme Nue, Femme Noire. People like Césaire, they said that people have to affirm their blackness. We have to show them what is blackness. Black is beauty. Black is creativity. Black is humanity. What they have written in books or what they have put in dictionaries, it's their own problem. We Africans have to define ourselves. That's the context you have to use, but not in terms of ideology, everyone did this or everyone did that. But thank you for the questions and feel free to ask the questions, all right? So the negritude writers, they wanted to get back what colonial education had suppressed. It means what colonial education had eliminated, alienation, brainwashing, lavage the cerveau. So the African worldview, characterized by the emotional expressiveness, spirituality, and harmony with nature. They turned to African folklore. Okay, they celebrated African folklore, African myth, rhythm as sources of poetic inspiration. So writers, artists said that we have a rich history and culture, and we have an oral tradition, We have traditional literatures that can inspire, and they revalorize all these cultural heritage of Africa. So in doing this, they transformed French, the colonizers' language, into a medium of liberation and resistance. They did not reject the language of the colonizer. They said it was a strategy to use the language of a colonizer and to do a kind of self-defense. All right? They used the language of the colonizer to show that they have to defend themselves and to react. So influences diasporic literatures. The impact of negritude extended far beyond the Francophone world. So the impact of the negritude, even if the negritude movement was initiated by Francophone writers, it was more predominant in the Francophone world, its impact went beyond this world. It reached the whole world. Negritude provided a powerful model of cultural nationalism. Yes. And it inspired Anglophone writers also. Some Anglophone writers, even if not all of them liked it, and the Caribbean and African American intellectuals. So, negritude did not only limit itself to the Francophone world, it reached the whole world. Even if not all Anglophone writers liked negritude, it influenced some of them. It also developed cultural nationalism. It influenced Caribbean writers, and it influenced, African American intellectuals. Is it okay, class? Are you with me, class? Is it fine so far? Any question? I can take questions. So the negritude movement also led the intellectual foundation of Pan-Africanism. You learned Pan-Africanism. Okay? You learned Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, what was it? Pan-Africanism, even if it were political, initiated by great leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and others, you see that the negritude movement also influenced these people. It led the intellectual foundation of Pan-Africanism. It insisted on the unity of all people of African descent. Yes, gathering all the children of Africa. In this sense, negritude was more than a literary style. It was a global consciousness. Yes, it was a global consciousness, gathering and calling all the people of African descent, all the Black people to reconnect, to go back to Africa, to revisit Africa. That reconnected Africa with its diaspora and asserted the value of Black civilization in the modern world. It was a kind of call for consciousness, éveil de conscience. It was a global consciousness raising, and it reconnected Africa with its diaspora. Okay? And also it asserted a kind of Black civilization in the modern world. So it means that the world had to change, and people had to consider the revalorization of African culture and civilization and history. So in Africa itself, negritude influenced the early post-colonial governments of leaders like Leopold Sédar Senghor, who later became Senegal's first president. Yes. Senghor, even in the exercise of his power, tried to put a certain dose of, cultural revalorization. Senghor's policies of African socialism and cultural revival, drew heavily from negritude ideals of balance, communalism, and humanism. Even in his exercising of power, he used this philosophy and ideology of communalism, universal civilization, and so on and so forth. But understand that there were still critics and developments of negritude. Nothing is positive 100%, nothing is negative 100%. Everything has ups and downs, limitations, and later development. Despite the enormous contribution, it means notwithstanding the great development and contribution, negritude movement faced criticism from later African thinkers and writers. Yes, the next generation after negritude, some of them criticize negritude. Some accuse negritude of being essentialist. Essentialist means portraying African identity as emotional and instinctive in contrast to European rationality. Meaning that they were in a too much self-defense kind of thinking that they have to do this, they have to do this, because simply the white man said that they should not do this and they had to do that. So if you take Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, whose famous quotation I cite, a tiger does not brag about its tigritude, it pounces. That's what you learn from Wole Soyinka. Un tigre ne proclame pas sa tigritude. Il saute sur sa proie et la dévore. A tiger does not brag about its tigritude, it pounces. This was against African identity should express itself through action, not self-proclamation. That's what he said. A tiger does not proclaim, un tigre ne se proclame pas. Okay? So similarly, it means in the same vein, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ngugi from Kenya. Ngugi also was a great African writer. He died last year in Kenya. No, he died last year in the United States. But Ngugi was a great, great African writer. All right? And Ngugi was from Kenya. He died in the United States. So Ngugi and Frantz Fanon critiqued negritude for focusing on racial pride without fully addressing the political and economic dimensions of colonial oppression. So Ngugi was an anti-colonialist. Ngugi said that people have to be very careful. People appreciated negritude because negritude, but the problem is that negritude was focusing on racial pride, but not showing the political and economical dimension, the economic dimension of colonial oppression. Did they pay attention to the oppression of colonization? Yes. Remember, Senghor said that colonization was a necessary evil. La colonisation est un mal nécessaire. They did not agree on that. Ngugi does not like that. Ngugi said that there was nothing more horrible and terrible than colonization. Yet, even these critics acknowledge that negritude plays a vital role in awakening consciousness of colonized peoples. Yes, even though, they did not share the same idea with some negritude, but at least they understood that and they recognized that colonization, played a vital role in awakening, say, éveiller, the colonized subjects. So later, some decades later, the ideas of negritude evolved into more complex forms of Black consciousness and Afrocentric philosophy, influencing movements such as the Black Arts movement in the United States, the Caribbean Creolite movement, and contemporary Afro-diasporic identity politics. So later on, some decades, 2 or 3 decades, means 20 years or 30 years later, it started because 30 years later, in the United States, there was the emergence of the Black Arts movement. The Black Arts movement. Black arts was political and literary. So Black arts also developed a lot of fields, ideologies of the negritude movement. That was in the United States with Amiri Baraka. And then also in the Caribbean, there were a kind of Caribbean Creolite movement and other contemporary African diasporic identity politics. So you see these movements were between literature and politics. Yes. You know, sometimes you cannot dissociate them. Remember what I told you in American literature. People like Thomas Paine, okay? They put literature into action, okay, with politics. So in Africa also, you see the same thing. Politics and literature were combined to fight for a cause. So I will finish with this paragraph, the last section. Before that, I want to take some questions. Are there questions? Feel free to ask questions. I can pick questions, or if you have comments, can you share? Is it okay so far? Are you with me? I hope everything is going well. Class? If there are questions, you can post them in the chat. And I pick. Okay, now the last section, the enduring legacy of negritude. Legacy, c'est l'héritage. Today, okay, good, thank you. Today, negritude is remembered as not as a closed chapter, but as a foundational phase in the long struggle for African self-definition. You will hear that people say negritude was in the past, but don't consider negritude as a closed chapter now. We can consider it a foundational phase in the long struggle for African self-definition. Don't consider negritude as a closed chapter. People should remember it. It should be kept as part of our legacy. Yes. It's not in our, common language what we say, oh, lol khewina, yerebi khewina. No. You cannot. This is a kind of cultural and historical acquisition. Maybe when you dress well, people could say, oh, this is nice, this is out-fashioned or whatever. When you talk about taste, all right? If you are discussing, you put your nice dress outfit, you can say, oh, it's very nice, but it is outdated, it is old-fashioned. Negritude, in terms of legacy, people should not consider it as a closed chapter, but still keep it as a foundational phase in the long struggle for African self-definition. Negritude taught writers and intellectuals to take pride in their languages, rhythms, and myth, to see the world through African eyes. Yes, wherever you go, all right, express your African identity, show your pride. In modern African literature, negritude, the influence of negritude can be left in the lyrical celebration of African landscapes, the valorization of indigenous wisdom, and the insistence on reclaiming African voices from colonial distortion. Yes, even in modern African literature, you see that this kind of nostalgia is there. It's present. So negritude, therefore, is a bridge between oral tradition and modern written African literature, between colonial resistance and post-colonial creativity. If you put negritude there, so that's why I said, let us not consider it as a closed chapter. It was a foundational phase. It just like what someone who says, if I am what I am today, it's thanks to negritude is not to be forgotten. So negritude reminded the world that Africa's past was not one of silence or darkness, no, but a beautiful one, an artful one, a philosophical depth was present. It's important to remember that. And that is part of the enduring legacy of negritude. So through the affirmation of Blackness, negritude transforms humiliation into dignity. Our people were humiliated, discriminated, dominated. When negritude came, it gave us empowerment. It made us powerful, strong, full of dignity and respect. We regained our dignity. So it set the stage for cultural renaissance, cultural rebirth. This kind of renaissance and rebirth redefines African literature today. That was my last, section. I hope it was helpful for you. So thank you for today. As I told you, it was a very short chapter. The lesson is not very long in the first year because, as I told you, I should make it short and simple for you to understand so that next year you love literature, you emerge, you read as much. Every text you read, you will understand it in the perspective of what you learned in the first year. That's how you got the passion to engage into literature. If there is not any question, I stop here. So thank you for today. It was a pleasure. Have a good day. So I wish you good luck for your test. All right? Get ready for your test. Contrôle continu devoir. It's going soon. So after you finish that, when you finish your test, quand vous terminez les devoirs, je ferai une dernière session pour l'examen. Oui. Le chapitre 3, je le fais après les devoirs pour vous permettre de réviser l'examen. All right? Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for today. Have a good day. Thank you very much.